All right, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Environmental Justice 2.0 with Dr. Gerald Torres, Yale professor and Stanford Class of 74, moderated by SACA board member Naomi Boak, also Stanford Class of 74. Just some housekeeping things now before we get started. I'm Janine Olson, co-chair of Stanford Alumni for Climate Action, and we are a nonpartisan science-based subgroup of Stanford alumni in sustainability, deeply concerned about the devastating effects of climate change. Our mission is to educate and inspire action, small and large, individual and collective, to meet the climate crisis. Today's webinar will be in conversation format and will close at about 5 p.m. Pacific. Please place your questions in the Q&A tab as you think of them, and that tab is at the bottom of your screen. Be sure to upvote those questions you would especially like answered. This event is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be emailed to all registrants in a week or two. You are welcome to converse with one another in the chat. If you find the chat distracting, however, you can click the caret button next to the chat box and unclick the show previews button. You can also enable closed captioning at the bottom of the screen. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker and our moderator. Dr. Gerald Torres has spent his career examining the intrinsic connections between the environment, agricultural and food systems, and social justice. His research into how race and ethnicity impact environmental policy has been influential in the emergence and evolution of the field of environmental justice. His work also includes the study of conflicts over resource management between Native American tribes, states, and the federal government. He is a former president of the Association of American Law Schools and served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the U.S. Department of Justice during the Clinton administration. Naomi Boak is a founding board member of Stanford Alumni for Climate Action. She is a primetime Emmy Award-winning television producer who in 2019 decided to follow her passion for Alaska brown bears and become a park ranger at Katmai National Park. She now works for the Katmai Conservancy. Her work there includes educating people around the globe about bears and the Brooks River ecosystem, as well as producing the annual social media event, Fat Bear Week. So now, please welcome Naomi and Gerald.
Hi. Good to
Thank
be
you.
here with Gerald. I'm going to have to say that Gerald and I are both class of 74, and we're very good friends at Stanford. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Gerald.
Naomi, thank you for hosting this. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to this. A confession avoidance. Naomi and I were lived in the same housing at Stanford, and actually shared an apartment with another classmate one summer. So I've known Naomi a long time. She even got me to appear on one of her talk shows once, I think.
Yeah, that's true. Wow.
Was that the Twin
My
Cities?
television past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Television past, exactly. So
Yeah.
thank you for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Well, this is an audience that's interested in the environment and concerned about the environment. But I think we should start out by defining what we mean by environmental justice. I think it's something that we don't specifically talk about enough.
Well, I'd be happy to do that. You know, to the extent that we can continue to stay focused on climate, we'll be happy to. But let's go back to the origins of environmental justice. What I'd like to tell people when I talk about it is that, you know, it's a movement, just like environmentalism. It's a movement-driven set of issues that arose. You know, my first encounter with it was 1978, so a long time ago. It's been slowly building, finally resulting in a national meeting right before the Clinton administration took office. And then when I was at the Department of Justice, they asked me to draft the first draft of the Executive Order on Environmental Justice. And what it is, first of all, it's about the distributional impacts of the of pollution, primarily on different communities, and it focused primarily on procedural defects, process failure, as well as unequal enforcement, and the effort to get the issues focused on more vulnerable communities. And so when you talk about environmental justice, the first thing typically that you're talking about are unequal distributional effects of pollution, however you measure whatever you want to call pollution. And then secondarily, procedural impediments to environmental justice communities, and we can talk about what those would be. Procedural impediments impede them from actively engaging decision makers.
Do you expand that definition to actions about climate change?
Well, one
It
of the
seems to me that, environmental justice is the goal, but where do we find the injustice?
yeah, well, one of the interesting things is the impact of climate. Once you can, the attribution science is still, of course, not complete, as you all know, and I'm sure this group knows, right? But if you look at communities that are burdened by the impacts of climate change, they end up looking a lot like the environmental justice communities who were, burdened by the distributional impacts in the kind of ordinary pollution context. Now, when you think about the climate impacts on environmental justice communities, you have to think about things like flooding. You have to think about things like increased storm impacts. You have to think about things like adequacy of insurance, even in communities that are subject to the impacts of climate change, whether they're fires, whether they're storms, whether they're flooding, whether the flooding comes from a storm, whether it comes from the rising sea levels. I mean, there are a number of ways you can look at it, but when you peel it back, what you discover is that the environmental justice communities tend to be as highly impacted by climate change as they are in the ordinary run of environmental issues. For Native people, there's also special difficulties because of the jurisdictional issues that arise. But also, Justin Farrell, a colleague of mine, just did a long-range study and concluded that the climate change impacts on Native communities is higher because of the effects on the land base than it is for most communities in the United States generally.
Yeah, we might think that, the things that you listed about climate change, like flooding and fires, and affect us all, but but what you're saying is that they have a significantly greater impact on certain communities who really can't do that much about it. Is that right?
Right, exactly. I mean, one of the problems, and what I mentioned in my earlier response, the kind of process failure, right? Well, process failure, of course, encompasses a wide variety of issues, but one of the process failures that you need to take seriously is the question of whether kind of democratic decision making is actually functioning, and whether the communities that are impacted have access to decision makers and are able to raise the issues which are important to their communities, in advance of the decisions being made. It's not necessarily a set of issues that are clearly, that you can clearly identify, because you've got to peel back the kind of administrative structure. Let me give you an example, though.
Just going to ask for one.
During the some of you in California can remember the energy crisis that bedeviled Gray Davis, right? And one of the things that Gray Davis thought he would do was to propose a new generation facility, and he thought he would locate this generation facility on publicly owned land, which makes sense. That reduces the cost of acquiring the land. But of course, the public land that he chose was a park in a Black community, right? And those of us who grew up in Southern California know that Southern California is actually relatively park poor. LA is particularly park poor.
Mhm.
So to take a park and convert it to a energy generation facility, Gray Davis thought he had a win-win. It turned out to be a lose-lose, and the community resisted it. But they resisted it only because the permitting process had been changed sufficiently that the community had time to mobilize and resist. Now, it meant that we in California had to think about other ways to solve the energy crisis that was facing us. And what happened? What California has done, of course, has been remarkable in terms of the amount of energy that it generates from alternative, non-fossil fuel based energy production. And so, in fact, not building that power plant in Southern California actually forced California to take a different approach to solving the energy crisis, the electric crisis facing California. And I think we're going to see the impact on wildfires in Northern California, as we'll continue to see, will also push California in the direction of addressing climate resiliency and energy efficiency and clean energy. One last example. California at one point had the only climate policy in the country, right? AB 32. It was a kind of a cap and trade program, a little more to it than that, but that's essentially a cap and trade program. Initially, environmental justice groups opposed it, right? And so there was a conflict between environmental justice groups and the mainstream environmental groups, because it seemed like the EJ groups were going to stand in the way of a plan that would make pollution reduction more economically efficient. But what the EJ groups pointed out is what the process of permit trading would result in would be kind of pollution hotspots in EJ communities. And so they went back to the drawing board, and out of it came the community benefit grants that flowed to the communities that were impacted from the income that's generated from the trades. Michael Mendez, who's at the University of California, Irvine, wrote a wonderful book, and I'd encourage everyone to read if you're interested in the relation between climate change and environmental justice. It's called Climate Change from the Streets, and it's all about the process that resulted in the modification of AB 32 back when that was salient.
So when you're talking about environmental justice and finding solutions, it sounds like some of these solutions are accidental as opposed to planned and purposeful.
So I'm not sure I understood your question. The solutions to environmental injustice.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, no, I think one of the things that the environmental justice movement has done is it doesn't want to leave things to chance. And in fact, it's tried to center the question of justice as environmental policy gets made, right? So it recognizes that every decision has distributional impacts, and let's map out what those impacts are going to be and ask whether this is the least harmful alternative that we can adopt. And it gets that question in front of decision makers earlier. So I think the movement-driven foundations of environmental justice means that people who are used to confronting power basically say that environmental issues are human health issues, right? They're transportation issues, they're mobility issues, they're every issue that governs how we live our lives can be both environmental, and it also has a justice component. And they're saying, let's take a look at how we can understand those together.
So you talk about environmental justice as a movement. How aware are the rest of us of environmental justice as a movement? I know, I mean, I can understand the examples that you're talking about, but I don't get the same sense about a movement the way, in some parts of action about climate change, like offshore wind, or different alternate energy sources. So what kind of a movement is it?
Well, I mean, it's heterodox, right? So there are broad national umbrella groups, right? But they are umbrella groups, and in fact, the way the issues get formulated are largely going to be based on what the local circumstances you provoke, right? So initially, the environmental justice movement was focused on ensuring that particular communities didn't bear a disproportionate burden of our industrial society. What the environmental justice movement also did was to ask Big Green to start to think about these issues as they think about the challenges to environmental decision making that the government's making, broadly speaking, but also to factor into their decision making, the groups, not the government, the groups factor into their decision making the principles of environmental justice, which are to take account as early as possible the distributional impacts of a particular decision. Now, has it been? Is it as broad as the general environmental movement? No. Is it as broad as what we would recognize as the climate movement? Probably not, but it's implicated in each of those. Now, remember, in 1970, right, Earth Day.
Yes.
Earth Day.
I was there. I remember.
Earth Day mobilized 20 million people to protest on a single day. I think it's still the largest single day protest in American history, right? So that motivated the passage of the environmental laws, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, RCRA, FIFRA, a variety of acts, which essentially define how we think of environmental protection. What the environmental justice movement did was to ask not that those statutes be undone, but to recognize that they facilitated certain decision making that didn't take the differently situated communities into account, right? So let me give you an example from that. Okay. Mm-hmm. So let's say the Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act has has standards for when waters are fishable and swimmable. For fishable waters, that means you can eat the fish that you harvest from whatever waterway you're interested in. But the level of contamination in fish that was deemed to be acceptable was based upon the average fish consumption of Americans in general. Americans actually don't, except for your salmon, which we'd be happy to talk about too, except Americans in general don't eat a lot of fish. Right. So in fact, for those communities that have a higher fish consumption, the standard that was deemed to be safe was actually not safe for them. So African American communities, immigrant communities, Native communities all consume fish at a higher rate than the average American diet. So in fact, just noticing that meant, oh, well, maybe we need to think about what the standards for safety ought to be for consuming this particular thing, right? So issues like that, which wouldn't necessarily occur to, nobody's acting in bad faith here, right? They're trying to set standards that are for safety. But if you're the ambit for the variables that you're going to take into account in making that standard are limited, right? Then maybe you need to, this environmental justice tells you to go back and think about it more broadly, right? So I mean, those are the kinds of that's one of the example of the way that environmental justice can inform kind of ordinary environmental decision making.
What I hear in a lot of what you're saying is kind of almost a top-down movement. I mean, are the communities that are affected invigorated and active and coming forth more and more, or is this a bunch of lawyers?
No.
Okay.
As a lawyer, I should say, well, lawyers do good work, right? So, but
there are some good things that lawyers do, yes.
But no, when I said it's movement driven, right? A couple of things developed that are, in fact, are we now think of as kind of ordinary, ordinary ways of living in the world. So citizen science. Mm-hmm. We all recognize the importance of citizen science. It's actually critical for assembling data, which can later be used. What I call a kind of neighborhood level epidemiology, right? So people noticing disease clusters in their neighborhood and then investigating that. Flint, right? The water crisis in Flint was generated by essentially citizen epidemiology, right? So and then they got experts involved who then did the testing that could withstand kind of the rigorous cross-examination. But it's in fact the communities recognizing the problems and then bringing them to the attention of people who can do something about them, and not just surrendering their agency, asking for a way to participate in the process that can help them address problems that are affecting their communities. Now, when we were drafting the executive order, one thing I did was to bring in environmental justice groups from around the country just to talk to me, teach me something about environmental justice. Mm-hmm. And that's when I discovered that the way I thought about the environment, or what is an environmental issue, was in fact really limited. And that, so let me give you an example.
I was just going to say, how so?
Well, I would talk to these groups and they would say things like, my kid doesn't have a safe way to walk to school in the morning. And at first you think, well, this is an environmental issue, right? And then you realize, well, wait a minute, it's a transportation issue, because if there's not sidewalks, right? If the streets aren't designed for pedestrians, but are designed in fact for cars, right? Then you're prioritizing cars or traffic over foot traffic. And maybe we ought to think about that, right? Or I've got to take 3 bus connections to get to a clinic. Well, maybe we ought to think about the transportation mapping to make those visits more efficient. So you then address issues of public health and you address issues of transportation. Now, I didn't think of those as, because I was just a knucklehead. I didn't think of those as environmental issues. But of course, there are environmental issues, right? One of the things that they they had me look at one point was the impact of toll roads. And now you think, okay, I'm normally not opposed to toll roads, right? Because it's just a fee, a use fee, right? If you use this road, you should pay for it. But if you don't think about the impact on communities by people who are searching for toll-free routes, right? So by instituting toll roads, you change transportation patterns. So that means you're going to burden some neighborhoods by people cutting through neighborhoods trying to avoid a toll or trying to reduce the toll they have to pay, right? And so we said, look, you've got to think about the changed transportation patterns. Which communities are going to be burdened by this tolling system, right? Is there going to be are there going to be any free routes, or are they all going to be tolled, right? So I would not initially have thought of tolling as a potentially environmental justice question, right? But it does bring you back to the question of the impact of transportation on communities. One other example. There are, I wouldn't have known this, right? But for talking to these communities, there are essentially diesel pollution hotspots, right? The diesel pollution hotspots are typically in ports. You're in a port. You're living in a port, right? Are typically in ports where you have smaller, dirtier diesel trucks that do the offloading from ships to the warehouses or wherever they're going to be transshipped from. Well, that meant that these communities are burdened by the increased diesel pollution that these smaller trucks carry, right? But it's complicated, right? Because in some of these communities, a lot of these smaller shippers, transporters, right? They're not making they're just moving freight from the ship to the warehouse to the bigger trucks. They were owned by people from the environmental justice community, right? So if you force them to clean up those trucks, you're increasing the cost to them. So then you've got to think about what are the, just like in every environmental regulation, what are the economic costs to the community by forcing the cleanup, and how do we do the cleanup in a way that protects both the economic foundations for this community and protects their health, right? So environmental justice leads you to ask those kinds of questions too.
Right. So, I mean, obviously you're looking at it from the perspective of a lawyer and legal actions, right? And
Class.
yeah. But for those of us who are not lawyers, I mean, what can we do? And for those people who are in communities where there's environmental injustice, I mean, a lot of my recent experience is in indigenous communities in Alaska, where, speaking of transportation, they got to fly their fish out. There are no roads, right? And there's great environmental impact that way. And there are also other things or other forces that want to encroach on those communities that would, like Pebble Mine, that might greatly impact or kill off the environments of those communities. So how does the connection between those lawyers and those organizations that can help, how do they connect with those communities when the community says, look, we don't want this. We don't want all this traffic here. We don't want these diesel fumes, or we see there's going to be major financial interests that want to take over, and we don't want them to come. How do they connect with legal resources?
Well, I mean, there are a number of environmental, the Big Green, I talked about Big Green, right? A number of Big Green groups that now explicitly think about environmental justice when they think about enforcing environmental laws. I mean, the example that you gave, the Pebble mine, if that mine were allowed to go forward, right, it would destroy.
Maybe we should explain a little bit of
Oh.
what that is, because
You can explain it.
well, Pebble Mine is a project that it's like whack-a-mole. This mining company that has destroyed several areas in British Columbia wants to destroy Bristol Bay, which is the last great healthy sockeye salmon run in the world. And we thought it was dead 20 years ago, but then politics changed and this company saw an opening and it reared its ugly head. And they thought, because these are not wealthy communities, that the people who live there would say, great, we're going to make a lot of money from mining and we really want this. But that's not what happened. You take it from there, Gerald.
Yeah, no, what happened was, well, I mean, to your point, I thought we've, put a stake through the heart of that effort on at least 5 separate occasions, right?
Right.
The one of the things that's in Alaska is kind of peculiar, right? Because you have native corporations and you have native villages, right? And the native corporations are distinct from the native villages. So the native villages could oppose the mine, whereas some of the native corporations might be in favor of it, right? And so what people try to do is say, well, the natives want this. Well, let's look more closely at those native groups that actually have kind of governmental authority to speak for their communities, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, they, to a person, opposed Pebble Mine. Pebble Mine, it's a gold mining operation,
right,
and other minerals as well. But it would have, to your point, destroyed the largest remaining wild salmon run in the world. The people in the native communities up there valued the salmon that was both a source of their own livelihood and crucial to the cultural foundations in some of those communities. So in fact, they joined with us. I'm sorry, us. They joined with NRDC. I apologize. I'm a trustee of NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council. They joined with Natural Resources Defense Council, and gave us essentially the place to stand to oppose this. That meant we weren't just outsiders coming in to stop this at Bristol Bay. We were actually supporting the community there. Similarly in Flint, NRDC got involved in that, but they only got involved in it at the request of the communities once they'd recognized that this is a problem. The Penobscot River in Maine, similarly, after it took 20 years of litigation, right? But the Penobscot River is finally being cleaned up. And in fact, some of the critical testimony were the native people in the Penobscot River Basin, but also the fishermen and the lobstermen from down in the bay. And what the lobsterman said in his testimony, which I thought was incredibly powerful, was, it's bad enough that you didn't tell us that there was mercury in the water, but you let me serve the fish and the lobster that I caught to my customers, my guests, and my family for 20 years. So that's what makes me really mad.
Yeah, I mean, for me, most immediately right now, I think of some of the larger issues. This year, apparently, the sockeye salmon are smaller. And for 2 reasons. One is that they're 2-year-old salmon coming back. They're not staying in the Pacific Ocean as long as they used to. And even those that are 3-year-olds are smaller. And what that tells me is that there's a bigger environmental justice issue in warming oceans, because the salmon are very sensitive to temperature, and those warming oceans may destroy that sockeye salmon run in Bristol
Right.
Bay.
No, it's something we actually have to pay attention to. When I was in law school, I used to eat lobster from, I know some people roll their eyes at this, from Long Island Sound, right? You can't get lobster from Long Island Sound anymore, right? It's too warm, right? So
Right.
lobster don't exist, so here in Connecticut, they serve lobster from Maine and pretend that it's local. But that's in our lifetime.
It's the same here where I am in Massachusetts. There used to be local lobster, no more.
Right, exactly. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about climate change and environmental justice, if I can get back to that,
Yeah.
it's the environmental justice impact of warming Long Island Sound meant that you had these lobstermen can't work.
Right.
Right. The one thing that the environmental justice communities that I spoke to have in common is that they are generally less well-resourced, if I can use euphemisms.
Yeah, that's a good euphemism. You can use that one.
Right.
You mean poor?
Be poor, yeah. But these communities have when they exercise agency, know what the issues are, even if they don't have an exact legal framing of the issue. And that's where we come in. That's where lawyers come in. We take what they tell us, and we try to figure out whether there is a legal remedy. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't.
So speaking of legal remedies and NRDC, I thought we might talk a bit about a couple of recent Supreme Court decisions. And since you are a trustee of NRDC, I'd love to hear you talk about the impact of Chevron v. NRDC and what the Supreme Court recently decided about that.
Yeah, well, there are two cases that are, I think, in terms of administrative activity, that are going to be important. One is the Corder Post decision, which essentially held that the statute of limitations for bringing a challenge to an agency action occurs when the injury arises, even if it's many years after the agency has completed its final action. I'm not sure what it means exactly, but what it suggests is that there are a lot of decisions out there that are likely to be challenged, even though we have acted in the belief that these decisions were settled, right? One of the things
these
that
are not short-term decisions, right?
Right.
These are decisions with long-term impact.
Yeah, and speaking kind of just normatively, right, one of the advantages of law for actors is that typically there is some finality. So you finally know what a rule is, right? Well, the Corner Post decision potentially unsettles that, right? And there was some back and forth among the justices about the importance of finality in administrative actions. But let's go to Chevron, the Chevron case. Actually, it's Loper Bright is the case. But what it did do was to essentially overrule NRDC against Chevron. And let me explain that decision briefly, and then I'll try to. What the Chevron case stood for was essentially the following: if Congress passes a statute and it is unambiguous, the agency is required to act consistent with the express views of the Congress. If Congress passes a statute that is ambiguous, what Chevron held is that if the agency interpretation of the statute is reasonable, right, it will be given a presumption of validity. What the Loper-Bright said was, if the statute is ambiguous, we, the courts, will be the ones to decide what the statute meant, right? Because that is the essence of a legal judgment. So what it means is, I mean, the Chevron case has been cited by over 18,000 court opinions between the time it was decided and now. What is the upshot going to be? Well, unclear, right? Because there are some statutes that are written where the Congress clearly gives to the agency the power to interpret what the rule should be. So adequate to protect human health. That's the standard. The agency and their experts can decide that. The next case.
Experts. Who needs no stinking experts?
Well, the next case is going to be, right, whether even that is an illegal delegation of congressional legislative power to the executive branch, right? So you could take all of these opinions of the last month and analyze them in terms of the way in which power is distributed among the various branches of government. And that's a task that has already been undertaken by some of us in the academy. But that's basically what, what's going on. And so there was great reassurance that this wasn't a big change, right? That we will still respect the agency's interpretation, but
they don't have the final word, do they?
They don't have the final word, right?
Right.
They will have some weight, but it won't be determinative. And I don't know if you wanted to turn to questions now. There's much more we have to discuss, but
yeah, no, I was just about to do that. So let's look at people's questions here. As a Stanford alum, I would like to know, what are the main initiatives that Stanford is doing to promote environmental justice? Are there any important centers or campus initiatives that we could support?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but my hunch would be that the Doer School, the new School of Sustainability, is where environmental justice is going to be located, and that there is, there's substantial interest in figuring out what environmental justice means for policymakers, and for this reason. Under the current administration, a couple of things are true, right? One is that the Inflation Reduction Act is directing some of the resources and has programs for directing resources to environmental justice communities. The energy transition that's being promoted by the Inflation Reduction Act, it will have an impact on environmental justice communities and an important impact on climate. In the executive order issued by President Biden, the Justice 40 initiative stands for the proposition that 40% of the benefits of environmental protection should go to environmental justice communities. Now, there isn't a clear metric for assessing what that 40% is, right, or how those benefits are measured. But at least it gives us a place to start. And in fact, I have some students working on developing those metrics as we speak. So there's that. So I would go to the Doer School, the new School of Sustainability. My suspicion is that there'll be some work there, and
that's just developing, right? I mean,
that's just developing, right?
Right.
And
maybe some people at Stanford can have some kind of influence of how that develops. I mean, that would be a good thing, right?
Right. Of course, they could support the Yale Center for Environmental Justice. I'm just saying.
Yeah, right. This is Stanford audience, Gerald. We'll do a Yale talk next. Another question, what do you see as the major environmental justice policy and or regulatory issues over the next few years?
Well, the main in California, and California's actually done a good job on this. There's two issues that are going to be critical. One is the energy transition and how that affects essentially low-income communities.
Right.
So things like net metering is going to be critical. It's how much do you get paid for the energy that you send back to the grid, or can you defect? Right? If we have completely distributed solar, can you defect from the grid? Well, the problem with that in California is that the grid, the way the cost of maintaining the grid is to be repaid is that it's going to be amortized through the ratepayers, right? So those are sunk costs by and large, and the extent that we need additional investment to harden the grid or to make the grid smarter, right? If that is spread over fewer people, it's going to have a higher impact on those people. And the communities that are least able to defect are poor communities. Right. So they'll be bearing a higher rate of that. So that's one thing. The other thing is water. In California, water issues remain critical. The issues relating to water transfers and water sales, as well as groundwater regulation, are going to be big issues.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this summer people can maybe feel that a little bit. Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned that I live in a port town, and I think one of the things that we are trying to figure out here is offshore wind, which is great, but when you talk about environmental justice for the working people here in this port, it's not so simple, right? I mean, how are they compensated? What are we doing to their income and their livelihood, which has to be part of the whole equation for developing offshore wind. So it's another example of.
Oh, absolutely. No, I was looking at the question that Bruce raised about greenhouse gases. It's not a binary in the way that the question suggests. And when you think about environmental justice and climate change, and you think about things like climate refugees, right? You often think about that as kind of international as opposed to domestic. But in fact, we have already relocated two communities, both native communities, whose land has been lost to rising sea levels, right? One in Louisiana and one in Washington State. So they're not completely coextensive, but they often are.
One said, agreed, at the same time, low-income residents in the U.S. are still disproportionately impacted by climate change. For example, there are millions of low-income residents who have endured extreme heat for weeks and don't have regular access to AC, and that's deadly, and it's going to be increasingly deadly. Do you want to just tell everyone what your son told you this week?
Oh yeah, no. My son, as I said, my little ray of sunshine, said, "Well, Dad, this is the coolest summer you'll have for the rest of your life." I hope he's wrong, but I fear he's not.
And I think it's something to remember that your son and that generation have their eyes on the ball there. Right,
Oh, yeah.
because they know that they're the ones who are going to have to live with more hotter summers.
Right. No, and my son's an adult now, so it's not like he's a little kid. But when he was a little kid, right, he did say to me, Dad, the world's on fire and it's your fault, right? So
How did you answer that?
I said, well, yeah, kind of is, but we're trying to do something, to atone, right? But Anna Rivera's question is important, right? It's my views on the use of the Colorado River and the impact on the Arizona Hopi and Navajo tribes. Well, there was another important Supreme Court case, Navajo against Arizona, and what the Navajo tribe was asking for was, let me back up. Under the federal law, when the tribes have a right to water sufficient to satisfy the needs of the reservation that they live on. There's a formula called practicable irrigable acreage as a technique for deciding how much water it is, but basically there is federal reserved rights for tribes. So what the Navajo were asking was for an adjudication of the quantity of water that would be allocated to the Navajo tribe. They weren't asking for the water. What they wanted was the United States to represent the Navajo's interest in the distribution of the water in the Colorado River. And the Supreme Court said, no, the trust duty doesn't extend that far. So that was a real blow. The Colorado River, I know this sounds bad, and I don't mean for it to sound bad, but the Colorado River, it's really a plumbing operation more than it is a river. I mean, so much water is taken out and put back in the Colorado River that by the time it exits, right, into the Sea of Cortez, right, the water is saltier than the ocean. It's something to think about. Now, Navajo and all of the tribes, as well as all the states on the Colorado River, have a claim to that water. But the reality is there's really not enough water, for everyone. And so it's going to have to be, they're going to have to be continually adjudicated. And tribes like the Hopi are quite suspicious of the federal government's tender mercies,
as they should be. So, Gerald, can you leave us with a hopeful note?
Absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely. Look.
Okay.
The hopeful note is this: that just as all of you who are here recognize that climate change is probably the biggest challenge facing us. I mean, that's an important thing to recognize, but it means that you've got to act, right? And what the environmental justice community says is, yes, and you've got to act with justice at the center of your actions, even as you must act deliberately to reduce the risks of climate disruption. And we are already experiencing climate disruption. So I don't think anybody on this call needs to have a fire lit under them to get to work. But you should recognize that if it's bad for you, it's just as bad or worse for communities that don't have the resources that you have. And you need to think about how policies ought to reflect or take into account the injustices that mark our economy. And I think that's if you do that, will it solve all the problems? No, but it'll solve them in a better way.
Yeah. And so to be informed and make your vote count.
Yeah.
So, Gerald, thank you so much.
That's fun. Thank you.
Yeah, it was fun. And you've given me, and I'm sure everyone who has been part of this, a lot to think about and some things to do.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody that showed up. Janine, I want to thank you for hosting this, and I look forward to working with all of you. In the
Yes.
future. So thank you.
Well, thank you both so much. I just want to let our guests know right now that they're welcome to join us on Tuesday, September 17th, when we hear from Dr. Naomi Boak, co-managing director of the Stanford Hydrogen Initiative, in conversation with SACA board member Dr. Narendra Paul on all things hydrogen. We'll be sending out the registration link through emails next month. And now the SACA board extends its deepest thanks to Dr. Torres and to Naomi Boak. We hope this presentation has brought renewed inspiration to your climate action efforts. And please vote and help others to do the same. And thank you everyone so very much for joining us.
Thank you
Good
all.
night.
Good night.
Night.